Good morning, everybody. Hopefully you can all hear me. Welcome to today's Academy Finance Update. For those that don't know me, my name's Alex Makinson. I'm one of the partners here at Mitchell Charlesworth, and I will be your presenter for today's webinar. As usual, I'll just go through some of the housekeeping with you. Hopefully you can all hear me, but if you do have any audio issues your end, then you can log in via the telephone. The telephone number is on the screen along with the access codes and the webinar ID. Just quickly, please jot those down just in case there are any audio issues your end. Obviously, if there's audio issues my end, then there's not an awful lot we can do, I'm afraid. Hopefully we shouldn't have any technology issues today. Hopefully you can all hear and see me and see the slides. If we do, I apologize in advance, and we will send a copy of this recording out along with the slides later on if you do have any issues. Now, you are more than welcome, as usual, to send questions in via the chat function. That's all confidential, only I can see them. And I will try to reply to them. Likelihood is that will be at the end, because I'm a typical bloke. I can't multitask at the best of times, and certainly not whilst talking and pressing lots of buttons down the end of a microphone and webcam. You're also welcome to drop me an email at any point. My email address is on the screen if you don't want to ask a question via the chat function, but there are some issues you want to discuss or some questions you may have on the webinar, please just drop me an email at any point. And as I've just said, all of this webinar will be circulated to you afterwards, the recording of it, the slides. So there is a link in there that you need to follow or want to follow. You can follow it once we've distributed all of the slides to you. So a little bit about myself. Most of you probably know me. You've probably been on one of my webinars before. One of my areas of expertise is schools and academies, and I've dealt with schools and academies since their inception, to be honest with you. So I am one of the experts when it comes to dealing with academy trusts, but I think you all know that if you've been on one of my webinars before. As I said, I'm a partner of Mitchell Charlesworth, and one of our key sectors is dealing with schools, trusts, and academies. Now, we've got quite a lot to get through today. I've got you for, I'm going to say 45 minutes. My lovely marketing team have given me an hour because if you know me well, I often do overrun and take up all the time I need. But actually, I think I'm going to be done in around about 40-45 minutes today. So you might have a little bit of time to yourselves at the end. It will all depend on how many questions you've got and whether they take me a little bit of time to answer. So the first item on the agenda that we're going to talk about is the year-end accounts and audit planning. And I'm going to focus on three things specifically here. I'm going to talk about the trustees report, what's changed when it comes to the trustees report this year. We're going to talk about some extra income and funds analysis, and that's new for this year's accounts and audit. And then we're going to talk about the catch-up funding. Obviously, I'm referring to COVID catch-up funding. So that's item one on the agenda. We'll then move on to pupil premium strategy templates. That's new, that's coming in if you've not seen those before. I'm going to talk about the rates changes and the funding changes surrounding rates. I'm going to briefly mention fraud and ransom demands just because it's a very hot topic area at the moment. And I'm going to finish off with the trust capacity fund. Hopefully that'll take around about 40 minutes, give or take. So let's get started. Let's talk about the dreaded trustees report. I always think it's nice that they call it the trustees report, because I know full well that most of the trustees probably don't write the report. It's actually the CEOs and the CFOs that write this report. And it is a horrible document that you have to write every single year. I know that. I read it, I write them, I discuss them, and it's not very nice, but unfortunately it's a necessary evil when it comes to academy trusts. So what's new in this year's trustees report? Well, you're not going to be shocked or surprised when I mention COVID-19. It's still on the agenda for everybody. It's that word we are fed up of talking about, to be honest with you. And it's there in the trustees report in greater detail this year than it was last year. And I'll go on to that in a little bit more in a few slides' time. Now, the guidance surrounding this is all in the supplementary bulletin to the AAD. Now, the AAD, the Academies Accounts Direction, we'll all recall was split this year. It used to be one great big booklet. Well, one not big enough, so we've now got 3 booklets this year. We've got the Academy Accounts Direction, we've got the Coke Down accounts, the example accounts, and we've got the Auditor's Direction or Auditor's Guidance. Well, in addition to those 3, we actually have the supplementary bulletin to the AAD for 2021. That was new last year. A lot of people missed that last year, and because they missed it, they failed to include a lot of the COVID-19 disclosures. Well, it's been updated this year. We've got this supplementary bulletin this year. We'll probably have it next year as well. I don't think COVID is going anywhere anytime soon. That tells us exactly what we have to do in relation to the COVID disclosures within the trustees report and some of the additional notes that I'll be talking to you about. So there are some additional changes and some differences to this year's disclosures that need to be reflected this year compared to last year. And the DFE have actually carried out a review on some trustees' reports this year and have made some comments in relation to reports and what they hope to see going forward and some things they don't want to see that has happened in the past. So I'm going to briefly talk about that as well. So let's get on to the COVID disclosures that we should have had last year. The DFE, the SFA have reviewed a sample of trustees' report. I've even reviewed a sample of trustees' report, obviously for non-clients of mine. And the surprising thing is the amount of trusts that missed the disclosures last year, or instead of actually disclosing what they should have disclosed, they either had 1 paragraph or 1 line or no reference whatsoever to COVID, or even just said refer to the website. Now, if you did any of those, I'm afraid you're non-compliant, you haven't met the minimum requirements in accordance with that supplementary bulletin. And if you use the lack of a better term here, it requires improvement when it comes to your trustees report because you're not doing what you should have done. Now, what you should have done last year that has been carried forward into this year is disclosed 10 key items. Now, those key items have been split between location and there are sub-locations. So you see on the screen now, you will see under item 4, we've got achievement and performance, but it's in the sub-location of fundraising there rather than the overall achievement and performance. And there is a requirement to comment on the impact of funding. So in other words, you couldn't fundraise because you couldn't hold the Christmas fair or something like that. That had an impact on your fundraising income. That then may have linked back into reserves and everything else going on there, or certainly charitable donations. So you've got 5 items that you should have put on this screen in certain locations, all to do with how COVID impacted on those items, so how volunteers have been affected, how staff and beneficiaries, how the pupils have been affected. Now that's a massive one, obviously, to talk about there, whereas fundraising may be a smaller one. Equally, we've got another 5 on the next page here, all to do with financial reviews. So everything from going concern, couldn't the trust continue, impact on the reserve policies, investment policies, risk, the plans for the future, what's going to happen if the pandemic continued. All of those things should have been disclosed last year, still have to be disclosed next year. And I think you'd be surprised on how many trusts missed putting those items within each section of the trustees report. It was a pain. The trustees report is long normally, and obviously you had these extra items to put in the trustees report last year, and that's carried forward into this year. Now, when it comes to the ESFA review, they specifically mentioned some things in relation to the trustees report. I'm going to talk about generally, and then I'll go on to sort of COVID related matters really here. The first thing they commented on is they weren't happy with boilerplating reports. So they weren't happy with reports that were being copied from other trusts that were just being updated from the previous year with 1 or 2 little tweaks or changes. They want it to be quite specific to your trust. They want it to be written every single year, and I know that takes a lot of time and a lot of effort to do so. There are certain things that obviously will naturally carry forward from previous years, but they don't want this boilerplating and plating report. They want it to be unique, specific to your trust. So when people read this, they understand exactly what is going on in your trust. Now, when they looked at last year's, they weren't happy with a number of areas governing the financial position. Now, all of this is around the COVID impact, I must say. And the first thing was impact on reserves. They said lots of schools mentioned COVID impacting income, but they didn't mention the impact on reserves. Now, obviously, if income has dropped, it may be in your other income side, so your before and after school clubs or your nurseries, those sort of things. Usually that linked into the reserves, it linked into your surpluses going down or deficits incurring or increasing. And there was a lack of evidence, there was a lack of comment on the impact on those reserves. That also linked into the reserves policy, where when they looked at certain policies, certain trusts have a reserve policy that might be to retain a certain amount of income within their reserves, a certain amount of surplus going forward that might be linked to a couple of months worth of costs or a couple of months worth of wages costs. Well, obviously there's been an impact on reserves and it's fallen below that policy. Well, the policy wasn't reviewed, the policy wasn't changed, there was no comment on why that policy was no longer adequate because of the impact of COVID and because of the impact on reserves there. So they said, trustees, please just have a quick look on the impact on reserves and that reserves policy to make sure it all makes sense. Because obviously if your reserves are showing a certain figure, let's just say your reserves are showing 100,000, yet your policy says that you should have a reserve policy of at least 150,000, alarm bells are going to start ringing because you've not met your policy. The reality is you probably just needed to revisit your policy and lower the expectations because of the impact on COVID. Now, they have mentioned sustainability and financial uncertainty. I'm going to link these two things here together. And this is all around the other income side. So obviously we had all of the impact over your trading activities ceasing, your additional income, your other income stopping. And there was very little evidence over what the impact was on that, what the consequence was, and what the uncertainty if it happens again. So I think for this year, they certainly want you to mention it, especially if we do end up, heaven forbid, having to close schools down again. And what happens if you lose that income again? How is it then going to link back into financial uncertainty, reserves, policies, all those sort of things? So that was their overall comment in relation to those additional notes surrounding COVID and what they want to see this year that they didn't see last year. Now, what's new this year in relation to the trustees report? Well, the main thing is the funding. It's all about the additional funding you've received this year in relation to COVID, how it's being received, how it is being spent, and the impact. They're calling it the deployment of the COVID funding, but for you, you're talking about how you're going to spend it, what you're going to do with it, what your plans are for it, and that should be included in the trustees report under that section and saying, yes, we have received a sum of money, the catch-up premium for COVID, and we've earmarked it for X, Y, and Z, which will help do this and do that. And that's what you should be putting in the trustees report in relation to the deployment of the COVID funding. I appreciate there's lots of different funding when it comes to COVID, and I will go through them a little bit later. So there's quite a lot to go in there. It's not going to just talk about catch-up. It's going to talk about quite a few things depending on what is unique and specific to your schools there. Now, in relation to the governance statement, I know we're talking trustees report, but I always do link the trustees report to the governance statement because it's almost in one. They said they want to know exactly how COVID has affected the governance arrangements in the last 12 months. The most obvious one, obviously, is switching from face-to-face meetings to remote meetings. That's common. That's a very easy one to put down. But you've got to go into a bit more detail than that. You've got to say, okay, what about all the things that couldn't happen as a result? What about all those checks? What about those trustees that normally come in and check things and review things? If they couldn't come in and check, how have they checked it? What have they done? Has that gone online? Has it gone remote? Is it that you've done it a different way? You need to talk about the trust risks and control frameworks around that, how you've changed the way you've done things to make sure that your governance is still good or better here, because it will be different now than it was in the previous year and the year before. Obviously, you didn't have to mention this last year. You do have to mention it this year within the trustees report. So you can see that dreaded COVID word is coming back everywhere when it comes to the trustees report. we should have those minimum 10 points that we mentioned earlier on. We should be talking about the financial position, the impact reserves, the financial uncertainties. We should be talking about all the COVID funding, what's being received, how it is being spent, what is the impact on that spending, and how our governance arrangements, our checks, our procedures with regards to the trust has changed. And all of that is then going to be encompassed into the trustees report. And lo and behold, you can imagine that trustees report is going to be 10 times longer than it probably was 2 years ago because of all that additional information. I appreciate that's an awful lot you've got to do in the trustees report that you normally either send off to your accountants or give them to your auditors once they've got your financial statements. For us, for those clients that we've got on board today that are here with the webinar, we obviously send across to you a lovely template of the trustees report. All you have to do is follow the template, put the information within, and it will guide you over what you should be putting in and where. Obviously, we can't write reports for you. You have to do that. And then we just incorporate it into the accounts. And we have to check that you've ticked every box in relation to what you should have included. So your auditors obviously have to make sure that you are including everything within that supplementary bulletin. It's not just the Academy Accounts Direction, it's that supplementary bulletin, because that's all the extra information in relation to COVID that I think we'll have for at least another year or two, depending on what's going on. But fingers crossed, and I do hope it will drop out in the next year or two, because I think I am fed up of reading about COVID, and I'm sure you are as well. Okay, moving on to the next section. The next section is extra income and funding analysis, and I'm going to put in the catch-up premium and the treatment into this section as well. And it's all about what's new this year. And what I've tried to do is I've tried to extract one note from the Academy Accounts Direction / the Coketown Direction, and I'm going to put it on the screen for you now, and hopefully you'll be able to see it in a few moments' time. So what I've done is I've extracted note 4, which is the income note in relation to Academy Trusts, where you disclose the income breakdown from the DFE, ESFA, and other governments. And we've got some new additional breakdowns this year that we didn't have in the previous years. They were optional in previous years. They're now mandatory and requirements this year. So I'm going to try and highlight a few things, but this is where things fail miserably. Hopefully it won't. So in previous years, we would have had GAG and the DFE, EFA grants, and we would have had potentially other DFE grants. And then we've got other government grants at the bottom, local authority grants, those sort of things. So your SEN would be under local authority, pupil premium plus would be under local authority. Well, this year, we've got certain things separating out. We've got universal infant free school meals, and we've got pupil premium being disclosed separately. Income on both of those items must now be disclosed separately. If you're used to doing your Academy Accounts return, they're disclosed separately on the Academy Accounts return. So this is bringing the accounts in line with the Academy Accounts return. So normally whoever's doing your Academy Accounts return has to drill into the detail, has to pull out universal infant free school meals, has to pull out pupil premium. And obviously that's done December, January time. Well, now it's needed for your accounts, not just your accounts return. It has to be disclosed separately, the separate lines for universal infant free school meals, the separate lines for pupil premium for this year under the heading of other DFE, EFA grants. So that's new on the income side. Now I have treated, I say treated, wrong word there, cheated is the right word, cheated a little bit here, because I've got another table I'm going to show you in a second, which carries on from this note. And it's all about more COVID breakdowns on note 4. I'm totally fed up of the word COVID here. Now, if I show you this table, you will see at the top, and I'll try and highlight this, we've got the other government grants coming in here. So the local authority that I briefly mentioned, that was on the top of the other table. So at the bottom of the other table, rather, you'll see here they are in the other table, they're down here. Now on this table here, we've got totals at the bottom. Reality is we haven't got these totals because on the supplementary bulletin, we have extensions to this note, all to do with COVID. And you'll see it here on the extension to the note, we've now got two extra headings: COVID additional funding DFE ESFA and COVID additional funding non-DFE ESFA. And I'll briefly explain what I mean by those two here. And I'm going to try and highlight. So we've got here under the DFE ESFA income lines, we've got catch-up premium being disclosed separately. So under this example, the trust has received £250,000 worth of catch-up premium. They've also got other DFE funding coming in. That might be exceptional cost funding, it might be summer school funding, and that's disclosed under other DFE income COVID, and that's put there at 20,000 under this example. Then under the non-DFE, we've got things that don't relate to the Department of Education, that's come direct from central government. The big item there is the job retention scheme, the sort of furlough scheme as it's called. So in this example, this trust received £80,000 worth of furloughing income, which is disclosed separately under non-DFE income compared to the ones above, which are from the DFE. So you can see we've got a lot more breakdowns when it comes to the income lines, all to do with COVID. Now, I bet my bottom dollar that most people have actually put all of the COVID income into one line within their accounting system, one narrative, one nominal code, put all the COVID income probably into one, potentially, and they're all going to have to be split out. So your accountants, your auditors are going to need a full breakdown of all the income you've received for COVID and where it is coming from as such. Now, you've probably noticed there's a bit of narrative at the bottom, and I'm going to try and make it a little bit bigger if I can here. You can see some of it down here. Now, they want you to describe exactly what's going on. So in this scenario, an academy has received £250,000 worth of catch-up premium, and it's incurred costs of £200,000. So it's spent £200,000 of that catch-up premium, and £50,000 is going to be spent next year. So in other words, it's got a carried forward of £50,000. Equally at the bottom, here we've got an academy has furloughed some staff in relation to catering, boarding as an example here, and they've received £80,000. The cost is sat in staff costs, which are disclosed separately in the accounts. So they want some sort of narrative here. Now, I did get a question from one of my clients the other day that says, Alex, we've received a sum of money for COVID premium, and I'm going to use the figure on the screen here, 250,000. We spent 200,000. We're going to spend 50,000 next year, but I don't want to show a surplus. I don't want to show that in my financial statements because they're going to look very good. And next year they're going to look very bad, aren't they? Because I'm going to spend the 50,000. I want to bring that 50,000 into this year. But unfortunately, you cannot. It is a surplus. Unfortunately, if you haven't spent your catch-up premium that has been allocated to August, it will naturally be a carry forward. It will naturally sit in your reserves for next year, and then you'll spend it next year. Unfortunately, you can't match just because you want to match. If you haven't incurred the costs, you haven't spent the money, it will roll forward. I know a few trusts are a little bit worried about that because it is going to mean they're going to be showing some surpluses, and next year might be concerned when they show some deficits, but don't be afraid of that. That's just what you have to do. That does lead me very nicely onto the funds. Now, when I talk about funds, I'm talking about surplus and deficits carried forwards, and these are normally split across certain categories in the financial statements. So they might be unrestricted if you've got profits from before and after school clubs, or you might be restricted if you've not spent all of your gag income. Now, we've got new funds this year. We used to be very straightforward. We used to have just one or two in the restricted section. Now we've got a load more, all to do with the blasted COVID situation. Now, the normal situation we would have is we'd have the general annual grant, the gag, we might have other grants, and we might have pension reserves. That's what you probably have seen in previous years. And if I take the gag as an example here, so in this example, we've got 98,000 brought forward, income of 4.5 million, spend of almost 4.2, some transfer to capital funds of 10, and a carry forward of £413,000. Well, this year, we've got all of these items on this left-hand side here, all coming in, which we have to disclose separately in a fund as well. So in other words, we have to put in all of the income that we've received from universal infant free school meals, from pupil premium, or from that catch-up premium for COVID, and allocate the expenditure and show whether there's a surplus or deficit on each one going forward. So if I take as an example here that catch-up premium line, you'll see, hopefully I can highlight it, we've got catch-up premium. In this example, the trust has got £250,000 worth of income. It got £200,000 worth of expenditure. It naturally has a surplus or a carried forward of £50,000 for next year. That will be reflected on the SOFA, that will be reflected on the income summary there, but it is disclosed separately. Whereas before, well, we didn't have catch-up premium before, but we certainly had pupil premium and universal infant free school meals historically, and they could have before been included in other grants. Some trusts did disclose them separately, you weren't obligated, but now they do have to be disclosed separately. There is always the question over allocation, and this is where you have to work closely with your accountants and auditors to say, actually, how are we getting to these figures? How are we showing that these figures are 45,000 or 40,000 or 200,000? Because most of the costs might be wages and salaries. Well, naturally, they normally get allocated to GAG, but you might have to repost certain costs across to certain areas, and you've got to keep a note on what those costs are, what those allocations are, because obviously, and we're talking about pupil premium a little bit later on, it should match up to other areas that you've been talking about and you've got logged elsewhere. So you should be working closely with your accountant and auditors on these allocations. Lots of software packages do allow you to allocate cross funds. I know lots of trusts, sadly, that don't do that. They don't allocate across funds. It's a complicated area to do. They leave that for the accountant to do at the end, and they have a conversation with them. So just be conscious here that this fund note is now a lot larger, a lot more complicated. There's going to be a few conversations to be had around the allocation of costs and those carried forwards going forward into next year. I'm hopefully going to move on to the next section now, all being well. Going on to that COVID funding, because you're all thinking, well, what COVID funding do we have? What do we need to show separately? There's a lot more COVID funding than we first of all think. We've got the obvious one, which is the catch-up premium. Every school will have the catch-up premium. Every school that will be included. But we've got quite a few other ones that may or may not be appropriate that you may or may not have. So you've got the tutoring program and the workforce fund, a little bit rarer. The exceptional cost funding, obviously that depends on whether you qualified, whether you actually had exceptional costs, and whether your trust at the time was running a surplus or a deficit, whether you could claim that. Whilst catch-up premium is shown separately, the others are shown in one lump sum under other COVID income. Now, this is the income stream from the DFE. This is not the income stream from central government because they're separated out. We've also got the mass testing funding, so you may have been incorporated into that. You've got the summer school program, and we've got the additional costs for restricted attendance. So there's quite a few COVID-related income streams. Your accountants and your auditors will need to know all of the income for all of those. So if you've not separated them out and you don't know the details, please go back, schedule in some time, separate it out, go into your accounting systems, drill down, get all the details around all of these items, because they will need to be disclosed separately in your financial statements. Hopefully that all makes sense. I'm going to move now into pupil premium and the new strategy statement. And I'm going to say the purpose of the strategy statement here. Pupil premium is nothing new. We've all seen it for years. We've all seen the reports we've had to write and publish for years. I don't think that's of any concern to anybody. I don't think that concerns anybody. I don't think anybody is worried about that. Well, I think the Department for Education must be worried about it because we've got the new strategy statement. And what they've actually said here is that the strategy statement is there for you to explain how the pupil funding is being spent and the outcomes are being achieved from there. Now, that statement is nothing new. we've always reported on pupil premium in the past, and we've reported exactly like that, or we certainly should have. But what's all this strategy about? Well, I'm afraid it sounds to me like the ESFA, the DfE, just aren't happy with what is being disclosed in that pupil premium report for many trusts. And as a result of that, you've now got a new requirement. That new requirement is to complete certain templates and complete this new strategy statement. The statement must be published by the 31st of December each year. Why is it December? Well, it's to allow you to assess your impact of the children when they come in the new term from September, and then to obviously put the statement together and publish it by the 31st of December each year, and that must be on your website. It is now a condition of your funding. So if you don't comply, you are in breach of the Academy Financial Handbook, and that results in all the consequences of being in breach. So I can imagine next year, one of the internal scrutiny requirements will probably be just to make sure you've got that statement on the website and you actually are completing all of the templates. So it is a condition of funding. I have put on the screen, and you'll be able to link it back through when you get the slides, the link to the guidance on the strategy statements. And the Department of Education have said that they will be publishing some example statements very soon. They said they're going to do 3. They'll do a primary, a secondary, and a special. When I last checked last week, they weren't there. I think they will be there imminently. So watch this space. What I would say is just don't copy them. That boilerplating going on, you can just imagine what the DfE will say if you actually see you just copying what they put there and just changed all of the income details and all the expenditure details. But there is examples, so you can see what should be written in the statement. So let's have a look at the template itself. I don't think the template is overly complicated, and I'm going to try and make it a little bit bigger so you can actually see it properly on your screen. Hopefully you can now. So the first page on the template is just a school overview. It's not complicated, it's not difficult, it's not going to take you a long time to prepare. Just showing all your details related to your school, who the pupil premium lead is, who the trustee lead is, and when you're actually doing it. And then the bottom half is all about the income you should be receiving, so your budget, your allocation, what you then need to spend. That's fairly straightforward. I don't think that's really new, and I think if we were doing pupil premium reports in the past, we probably should have put that in the report or certainly reviewed it and assessed it. Part A of the strategy statement, if I make this one bigger as well, it's all about a statement of intent, what we try to achieve, what the objectives are, what challenges we are facing. And I think if our previous pupil premium report were good, then we should have obviously mentioned all of those things. Well, we're now obligated to do so under this template. On the bottom half, we're talking about attended outcomes. So what we're trying to achieve here, what the outcomes are going to be, and the success criteria is how we're going to measure those outcomes more than anything else compared to the challenges we are facing. So a little bit of detail going on the template here. On to the next page of the template, there are a couple more pages to it. We're talking about the costs, and there were a lot of schools and a lot of trusts don't like to put costs in relate down to the pupil premium report. Well, now you're obligated. Now you've got to put in your budget costs. If you're allocating teaching costs to pupil premium, you've got to put how much of the budget you're allocating, what activities they are doing, how you're going to support it, what challenges they are going to address from the previous page. And that's just the first section. Obviously, we're getting onto targeted support, wider strategies, and you're allocating costs accordingly there. And then you're totaling your budget costs there. Hopefully that budget cost will match the budget income there. And if I get onto the next page, part B is all about reviewing the outcome and saying actually what's happened, what external provider programs, and then finally at the bottom, if you've got any service pupils, in other words, the armed services, the additional income that comes through there, what you're doing in there. So you've got quite a lot to do in relation to the template, and that template has got to be published along with the report itself on your website, 31st of December. Please don't miss it. There are examples coming, so you can actually see what you do need to do in addition to just completing this template, and it will give you a sort of steer for how they should be reported. Okay, moving on to this sort of next session. I'm whizzing through this today, to be honest with you. Either I'm talking fast or my slides aren't long enough. We're on to ransom demands next. At the end of last term, there was a big spike in ransom demand attacks, and last year, on the whole, schools were a targeted sector. There seemed to be a huge feedback from schools that they were being attacked left, right, and centre with regards to ransomware, with regards to phishing emails, trying to access their systems, trying to shut them down. It got so bad at some points that there was going to be notices published to all schools, and actually the CEO of the ESFA, Elaine Miller, did write to accounting officers and did remind them about this and talk about what is going on. We envisage this will continue into the new term. We envisage that schools will still be targeted by ransom demands going forward. And we just want to point out a couple of little things for you here, because I do often get called by schools and say, actually, what can we cannot do in relation to the Academy Accounts Direction with regards to ransom demands. And at the end of the day, it's very straightforward. The DfE does not endorse the payment of ransom demands. Even if you wanted to pay it, you must obtain permission from the DfE ESFA, and they have stipulated that they will likely not grant that permission. So that means if your school has been targeted and you've fallen foul of a ransom demand, the likelihood is, even if you think paying it might get your information back, you're not going to be able to pay them, and therefore you've got to look at other measures to getting your information back. Now, the most obvious thing here is prevention is better than cure statement here. And you're probably all asking, what has this got to do with accountancy? What's this got to do with finance? What has this got to do with auditing? Well, when we as auditors review Academy trusts, the one thing we ask to look at is your risk registers. We assess your trust risks. Well, ransom demands and IT attacks now have increased to almost the top of the list when it comes to the risk assessments, and they should be included in your risk assessments. And if they're not, why not? You know, what is the likelihood of it occurring now is high, if not extremely high. What measures have you put in place if you are attacked? How can you prevent it? And how can you actually deal with it if inadvertently someone has actually locked you out of your systems there? What we do envisage is that trusts should be incorporating a review of your IT systems, a review of that part of your risk assessment in your internal scrutiny reports. Now, we are accountants, we are auditors. If you engage your accountants or auditors, well, actually you can't engage your auditors because you're not allowed to have your internal auditors be your external auditors. They no longer can be the same. But if you have engaged an accountant to provide you with an internal scrutiny report, well, whilst accountants are good, they're great. We can comment on figures, we can certainly comment on risk statements, but we're not IT experts. We can't comment on procedures and measures you've put in place that govern your IT systems. You should have experts that check that, and that should be linked back into your internal scrutiny reports, because obviously if you do suffer ransom demand, the impact of it is going to be huge. The cost could be huge. I dread to think how many man hours you would lose trying to put it all right. It is going to happen at some point to your school. One would have thought, you pray it doesn't. I'm afraid schools are being targeted left, right, and centre, and all it takes is one person to inadvertently click on the wrong link. Okay, moving on to rates. And I'm just going to refresh our memory here when it comes to what happens with rates. And I'm going to use an example of a mainstream school converting to an academy. That's probably the best way of explaining it. When a mainstream school converts to an academy, what normally happens is the local authority sends them a bill for their rates. So that bill comes along to the academy school. Now, academies are exempt charities, so academies can apply a 80% deduction to that rates bill. So let's just say the local authority has sent me a bill for £10,000 when I converted and said, here you go, here's the next 12 months worth of bill, and it's £10,000. I then go back to them and say, actually, I'm an exempt charity, I'm an academy school, please apply the 80% discount. They do so, they send me a revised bill for £2,000, the 20% balance. The Academy Trust writes the cheque out for that £2,000. What they then do is they go on the portal and they claim that £2,000 back from the SFA, and that money then comes in. So you can see we've got £2,000 expenditure, £2,000 income, and the net effect is null. As an accountant and auditor, when I review people's accounts and audit, I obviously look at rates bills and I go to the rates expenditure line, and eyebrows start to rise when I see that maybe that's £2,000, but rates income from the DFE is nothing, or it's £1,000, because obviously these figures should match identically, even though that you know, Academy year ends runs to August, rates year ends runs to March. The figures should be the same regardless of that prepayment. It is one of the most common things that's forgotten about. You pay your rates bill, you leave it one side, you never do the claim. So you've got the expenditure, but you've forgotten to claim the income back. Well, you'll be pleased to know from April 2020, the SFA have said academies no longer have to pay the rates themselves. So that admin, bureaucracy, time and effort of having to put that bill on and pay it and then upload it and claim the money back and make sure you receive the money and make sure it all matches up. You don't have to do that from April 22. The SFA will be paying business rates directly to local authorities on behalf of schools. So I think that's a welcome change, because I think it was a bit pointless in the first place. Obviously, it's one government department giving money to another government department, so I can understand why it had to happen. Hopefully, it means one less thing for you to do. It does mean that the upload function for uploading that bill and claiming the money back, that will go. That will no longer be there going forward. There won't be a need for it, and you won't need to make any payments to your local authorities for the 22-23 rates bill. So in other words, the April to March bill that's coming in sort of 6 months' time, really there. You won't need to make those payments, but equally you won't need to reclaim it back. There. Now, one thing that they've mentioned here, that you will still be accountable for all rates in the past. So if you haven't made the payments and it's overdue, you still have to make those payments. And if you've inadvertently missed the reclaim, if you've not reclaimed your rates in the past, then you have until the end of March, so you've got about 6 months to go back and make those claims for historical years. So have a quick look at your rate expenditure, have a quick look at your rates income. If you've missed one or two, and it is one of the most common things, because it's a small amount of money, but it does soon add up, then you have got some time just to go back, just to claim those that income, but only until March. Post-March, if you haven't claimed it, unfortunately, you've lost it. Moving on to the Trust Capacity Fund. Now, this is a grant fund that has a certain pretty penny in it, the £24 million for the last financial year, 21-22, and it's there to help trusts grow capacity. In other words, take on more schools or to increase your pupil admission numbers, depending on what's going on. It's a competitive grant, you have to apply for it, but lots of schools don't. There are certain conditions, and there are two types of projects linked to it. The first project is all about taking on an inadequate or RI school. So if you're growing and taking on a good school, well, you can't obviously claim. The big thing here, it's in certain locations. So there's a list of locations, there's a list of local authority areas that you have to qualify in. The school has to qualify rather than the trust. And if it is in there and it is adequate or RI, inadequate or RI rather, then potentially you can apply for the grant, and it's between £50,000 and £310,000. So it's a substantial amount of money you could get, enough to potentially help turn that school around. But obviously, it's dependent on whether your trust is in those locations and you're wanting to take on a school from that location. The second one here, the second type of project, is all about capacity building. And you can see that the amount of money available on this side of the project is slightly less, £50,000 to £100,000. It's certainly not going to be enough to build another classroom. £100,000 doesn't go a long way, but obviously if you've got capacity in your school and you've got space but obviously you want to increase your PAN, the local authority is supportive, there's a need in your area, then it's certainly worth looking at to see what actually, what we can get some additional funding to grow capacity if we want and if there's a need there. And the DFE ESFA does have an eligibility checker, so you can go online, you can check to see whether it's worthwhile doing all the work in relation to seeing whether you can apply for this, whether you'll be successful. I think you'd be surprised on how many people thought they wouldn't be successful and in the end were successful and have claimed it. Obviously, it's much easier to claim it if you've got an inadequate RI school within certain locations and it isn't a second project, but you'd be surprised on how many people have claimed on the second project as well as the first. So go on and check if you think this could be of interest to your trust. There are normally 3 windows in relation to applying for this grant. The next application window, or the final application window here, runs from the 31st of October to the 17th of December. So you've got a bit of time to put things in place. So if you have got more schools coming aboard, if you are thinking about next year, then obviously you've got an application window here to look at and see what's going on, to see whether there is potential for income coming in. Now then, 45 minutes I have on my timer. I am bang on really, which is the first time I think ever when it comes to my webinars. I do have sort of 2 questions that I've come through. The first one is in relation to catch-up funding. And the first question says, will unspent catch-up funding affect my surplus? And the answer to that, yes, of course it will be. If you haven't spent your catch-up premium and you've got to carry forward, then that's going to be reported in its own fund, and it's going to report its own fund as a surplus, slightly separate from your GAG, slightly separate from other grants, obviously. But yes, and if you're looking at your trust overall and you're looking at your SOFA, your statement of financial activities, and your trustees are looking at that page going, oh, have we got a surplus or deficit for the year? Then catch-up premium that is unspent will skew that result. It will show that you've actually got a larger surplus this year, and then next year, if it's the other way around, you're going to see a deficit. So unfortunately, the answer is yes. The second question I've got through, which is a very interesting one, would rates still be reported in the accounts? And the answer to that one is, I don't know, to be honest, at the moment, because whilst it is said that the academies won't be responsible for the payment of it, in my opinion, I still think they're liable. And if they are potentially liable because it's on their property, then it should be reportable. It does then beg the question over how do you get at the figure? Because if that figure is then going to be sent to the Department of Education by the local authorities rather than to the academies themselves, how can you incorporate the figure if you don't know it? I think what we might find is we might find something in the accounts direction next year, which will probably say you don't have to disclose it, you don't have to include it at all. If that's the case, I'll breathe a sigh of relief, you'll breathe a sigh of relief, we won't care about rates at all in the financial statements, and hopefully that'll be the end of rates and we won't have that problem. Now, that's me done for the day. Hopefully that helped. Hopefully that gave you a bit of an insight in relation to the changes this year, in relation to the audit, in relation to the accounts, in relation to that dreaded trustees report, what you need to do on the pupil premium strategy document. Keep an eye out on ransom demands and the trust capacity fund there. You're more than welcome to drop me an email if you've got any questions at all. Thank you very much for your attendance. Very grateful, and I hope to see you all soon. Take care.